Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching Politico Live. My name is Bjarke Smith-Meyer. Normally, I sit on the finance desk at Politico, but today I get to be here with you at the Competitiveness Summit because I have the pleasure of interviewing the Economy Commissioner, Paolo Gentiloni. We've got a whole range of interesting topics to get through, some of which will include reforming the corporate tax rules, the EU's plans to introduce a digital levy, and of course, the fight against climate change. Now, just before we get to the main event, I do want to say that this is a pre-recorded event, so if you're sending in questions, I'm sorry, I won't be able to ask them to the Commissioner, but do not be discouraged. I will be back later on to talk about these issues again on different panels, and I'll make sure to look at your questions then. Now, moving on to the main event. Sei pronto, Commissario?
Sì, grazie. Good afternoon.
Great, thanks very much. As we go to air, one of the big topics that'll be happening is in Paris at the OECD, where global negotiators will be trying to come up with a political deal for G20 countries to sign off on later in a couple of weeks' time. And this overhaul is very much specific on two pillars. Just to very quickly say, Pillar 1 is trying to introduce a global tax for the 100 biggest companies, and Pillar 2 is to try and introduce a minimum effective corporate tax rate of 15%. Obviously, the Commission is watching this very, very closely, and I'd love to ask, Commissioner, I mean, how confident are you that we'll be able to get a deal by the end of the week?
Well, difficult to know, but I am slightly optimistic. Of course, we are not yet there. Meetings are going on, and I think that the final meeting should be on Thursday, tomorrow. What the basis of all this, I think it's very interesting and important. We know that the G7 is not the G20, and the G20 is not the inclusive framework. But we also know that the fact that in the London G7, we were able to reach an agreement is quite a good basis. Honestly, this would haven't been possible without the new US administration, without Secretary Yellen. At the very beginning of our meetings in the Finance G7, telling that they were retreating their so-called safe harbor proposal. And so this paved the way to the two possible agreements that you mentioned. Why are they so important?
No, just to say, given the fact that the G7 meeting was a couple of weeks ago, and as you say, the US made that move, which was particularly important in order to get to the point that we are today. But one of the things that the G7 communique did not dive into was this background discussion as to whether there should be some exemptions. The UK, for example, is pushing hard in order to exempt financial institutions from the Pillar 1, so the global tax. And then there's also this discussion as to whether big manufacturing companies, such as miners, should also be exempt from Pillar 1. I mean, where do you stand on that? Do you think that there should be exemptions, or should we just go for all of them?
Well, my main point, and the European Union main commitment, is to reach an agreement, to be honest. And so we will try to exercise our influence to contribute to be good broker of a possible agreement. Why? Because of course this is not perfect. If we look to Pillar 1, some exemptions could be at the end decided, but they are very controversial. And we know that this reallocation of taxing rights is for the moment only for these 100 giants winners of this crisis. So this is partial, but the principle that you are reallocating taxing rights, basing them not on where headquarters of the companies are, but where profits are made, is absolutely essential. At the same time, you could say that, and several academics said this, that a 15% minimal taxation is too low. But of course, this is not considering the real target of this effective 15% minimal taxation, which is to try to stop the race to the bottom. We are not asking countries to have 15% of corporate taxation. Several countries will keep their much higher corporate taxation. We are asking countries having a much lower level of corporate taxation to converge on a minimal global result. I think this is very, very important. Will we have exemptions? Well, I know that there are different positions, countries asking for financial services, other for manufacturing, other for mining. I think that overall we have to find an agreement, and we have to find it now, because after the G7, if we have an agreement in the Venice G20, we will really pave the way to something important at global level. So the European Commission will try to broke.
Sorry, Commissioner. No, just because you mentioned the aspect of the fact that the EU will also have to take this then forward. I think that we dive into an interesting aspect there when it comes to EU implementation, and when the Commission then issues directives in order to implement the rules. Could you imagine that the Commission would then maybe try and plug the gaps on exemptions, for example, for the financial services industry, for example? I mean, do you imagine that the Commission could maybe plug the gaps where the G20 could potentially not?
Well, we will see, but my impression now is that first of all, the mechanism of this so-called Pillar 1 will be a multinational treaty, and the adoption will be based on national ratification of this international treaty. So, of course, we will coordinate the EU position, but it is not yet the time, I think, to discuss how this coordination will take place, especially for Pillar 1, where, I repeat, the adoption will mostly function through national ratification of an international agreement. So we can coordinate the European position, but I think that we will not change substantially the international treaty.
Okay, it's an interesting point that you raised, that there might be some discussion as to a minimum corporate effective tax rate. Certain countries within the European Union, such as Hungary and Ireland, have rates that are below 15%, and they're not necessarily effective. How embarrassing would it be if the EU was unable to get the unanimity it needed in order to introduce this effective minimum corporate taxation rate?
Well, I think embarrassing is quite an understatement. I can't imagine Europe outside such an important new global rule. So, of course, I fully respect the position of single European member states that have a different level of minimal corporate taxation. What we are asking is not a harmonization. We are not asking to avoid any fair competition on taxation level. What we are asking is to put a brake on the race to the bottom. And I think that the proposal of 15% is realistic. Someone says even moderate. But I think that Europe will be in the deal, and I can't imagine such an important new global rule without the European Union.
Strong stuff there from the Commissioner. The tail end of this is that the EU is considering its own digital levy, which of course has its own political issues, mainly because the US has stated that they'll only sign up to the international deal if the rest of the world rolls back any unilateral efforts to tax their companies specifically. Now, I know that the Commission has been very specific about the fact that any digital levy that then comes in mid-July doesn't specifically target the US companies per se, but there's so little that we know about this, and obviously I understand that that's because we first want to get a deal through the OECD and the G20, but what can you tell us about this digital levy? What does it look like?
Well, indeed, your question was already including the answer, because indeed this is why I think we are now really concentrated on working to reach this deal. We do hope that this will be possible, and we are confident that this could be possible in the Venice G20. Then we know that there is a commitment connected to our own resources, nothing to do with the digital service taxation that we have in single European member states, but we will come with these proposals after the global agreement.
Let's. I mean, our viewers will obviously be very interested in anything you can give us. So I'll try and prod again just to see if I can get anything more out of you. I mean, the talk around Brussels town is that this digital levy will be targeting companies with a much lower revenue thresholds than is usually the case. Previous initiatives have targeted companies with revenue levels of 750 million, and there's talk of reducing that to 250 million so that you could rope in 9,000 digital companies operating in Europe. Does that sound right?
Well, this was probably something also in previous discussion. Maybe this, what is clear is that this proposal will have nothing to do with the previous EU proposals, and also with the reality of the national digital service taxation. So it will be in any case not a discriminatory targeted to digital giants, and it will not be a form of double taxation in relation to what we are discussing with Pillar 1 in the OECD process.
My final question.
I repeat,
on
all our commitment is on the OECD process now.
Yeah, sure. No, the final question that I have on the digital levy, and then we'll move on to a less controversial issue of a carbon border levy. I think the one thing that everyone would love to know is if Washington call you after the G20 sign this OECD deal and say, hey, Commissioner, don't introduce this? Will you say, okay, sure, Mr. Biden, I won't do it, or will you explain gently to the President of the United States that you guys have to go ahead and do it anyway?
No, we have very good relation with the new U.S. administration, and we agreed in the G7 communique to coordinate the work that we are doing for the global OECD agreement and other measures. And we will coordinate this as also member states will do at national level.
Great, okay. Moving on to the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or as we'll call it among friends, the Carbon Border Levy. You know, there have been some drafts that are floating around, and of course you don't comment on drafts, but the one thing that I think that our viewers would love to see or hear about today is just explaining generally how it works. We've heard your colleague and boss, Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis, talk about it being a phased initiative. Could you just explain to us what exactly we can expect from this carbon border levy?
Well, it's a climate measure, not a taxation measure. It is, in fact, functioning towards imports more or less as our internal ETS system is functioning with our domestic industries. The scope, I think, is very clear that we have a EU ambition on the green transition. This ambition will, I think, be even clearer after the presentation of this huge package of measures that we call, as you know, Fit for 55. And this ambition should gradually also become something that involve our imports from other countries, because we can't support the idea that we have ever and ever ambitious standards for our industries without this happening also for foreign companies exporting into the EU. Of course, this will not mean any form of protectionism, because we will exactly have the same treatment for domestic and importing companies. Mm-hmm. Of course, this needs to be discussed. We are not yet there, and we will have these proposals in the next weeks. They are not easy because we are, as frequently in the European Union, a little bit early movers in this kind of regulation. There is a lot of discussion on carbon pricing around the world, but this mechanism will be necessarily coordinated with moves taken in other economic players around the world. Yeah. So we need to be very cautious and gradual in these measures to give our industries certainty and our partners at international level the time to discuss and coordinate.
I'll get to the international aspect in just a second, but one thing that I'd love to explore with you a little bit is that the finance ministers of Germany and France have talked about creating a sort of climate club to try and introduce this carbon border adjustment mechanism. I mean, can you explain a little bit like what the idea was there when it was discussed in Lisbon a couple of months ago? And is it something that the Commission would consider?
Well, the letter of the German finance minister proposing this carbon club, I think, was a very useful contribution, and the rationale was and is to coordinate among different global players measures to be taken in this field. Of course, this doesn't mean that we are waiting 15 years to reach a single measures shared by US and China, Korea and Germany, Australia and France. This means that measures taken should be discussed with partners with an effort to coordinate. Our best wish would be in the near future to have a similar standards in different economic players around the world. That doesn't mean doesn't create the necessity of instruments like the one we are discussing about, the CBAM. So quite agree with the proposal, working to coordinate with other economic players, at the same time moving with our European proposals, because we can't wait. And I think the fact that we are advancing proposal will help the international discussion on these subjects.
It's interesting, you know, Europe can't wait. Europe will move forward. The US has pushed back against a CBAM, as has Australia very recently, especially when there is this attempt to try and make it compliant with the World Trade Organization rules, and there has been some pushback there. I mean, what do you say to these international players that then immediately, you know, push back against initiatives that are this important?
Oh, I only say what is true, that this proposal will be completely WTO compliant.
Fair enough. Okay, you heard it here. Thanks for that. One other interesting tax initiative that's coming up in the next couple of weeks is the EU's effort to try and update the energy tax directive. Now, we don't necessarily want to get into all of the nitty-gritty on this, but one thing that has been an interesting point among finance ministers and capitals is that the last time a country tried to hike fuel prices was in France, and that led to the Gilets jaunes movement, or the yellow shirts movement. How worried are you that we could inadvertently lead to a new EU-wide yellow shirt movement through this initiative?
Well, I think that we should, of course, consider the fact that this green transition should also be a fair transition. Fair and green is easy to say in words, not so easy, of course, to translate in proposals, initiatives. This is the reason why we are working very hard on this package, not only for the technical details, but we are working very hard exactly for the reason that we are fully aware of the necessity to combine green and fair transition. Otherwise, the risk is that with all the goodwill for the green transition, we will not be able to implement it. So dangers you were mentioning are clearly in our mind, but I think that the package that we will present will be able to combine the two elements: ambition in the green transition and at the same time fairness, compensation for regions and sectors more affected by this the weight of this transition. And this, I think, was already the case at the beginning of the launch of the Green Deal, and it will be the case also now that we increase the reduction of our emission goal to 55%. We are fully aware of this concern, and well, you can never say before, but I am confident that we are addressing properly the necessity to have not only a green but also a fair transition.
Great. We're slowly running out of time, but now that I have you, I think it would only be right to ask you a little bit about the Commission's plans to review the Stability and Growth Pact. One of the things that I've noticed in recent weeks is that you have countries in the north coming out and calling for strong fiscal discipline. Just at the Brussels Economic Forum today, Merkel said it just after the Euro Summit on Friday. The Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, said it a week before that. You had the Austrian Finance Minister who said it. Is there a risk that we could end up creating a renewed north-south divide by opening up these rules?
Well, the risks of differences is not if you open the debate on the rules. The risk of differences is there. You could even argue that the risk is stronger there if you don't open a debate on the rules, because unfortunately the previous crisis, the financial crisis, increased the real divergences among European member states. And one of the reasons why we were able to deliver on this ambitious Next Generation EU program was exactly to address this risk, the risk of increasing divergence among European member states. So differences are there. We will have this year the euro area with an average debt of 102%. This means that the majority of the population in the euro area lives in countries with debt higher than 100%. And this, of course, is something we have to address also with our fiscal rules, because I don't like the idea of having common rules and then saying, okay, don't worry, we will not take them seriously because we know that they are not realistic, but this is not a problem. I think this is a problem because for the well-being of our union, and after having decided such an important thing as the common Next Generation EU program, we need strong common fiscal rules. And these strong common fiscal rules should take into account, from my point of view, two problems. One, the reality of our different situation in fiscal, in finance, in public finance situation, and second, the need that we have to support growth and sustainable growth. So if you ask me what kind of rules, I would say realistic rules to be adopted in a real manner by all member states, and growth enhancing, sustainable growth enhancing rules. Not an easy task because, as you mentioned, we have different positions not only north-south. We have different position in the Union. But what are we there to do if not to try to build consensus on different positions? And we were able to build consensus on very difficult proposals during the pandemic. I think we have a good opportunity to do this also when we will reopen the debate on the review of the fiscal rule in the next autumn.
And with that optimistic note, I draw this interview to a close. Thank you so much, Commissioner. We've touched on all sorts of interesting issues here. As you said, embarrassing would be an understatement if we don't manage to implement the global overhaul or reform of global taxation rules. You promised that the EU digital levy will not lead to double taxation, and you also stressed the fact that we cannot wait for other countries before moving ahead on our own climate initiatives. And I also think it was particularly telling that you said that the north-south divide will only ever exist if we don't reform the rules, and we need realistic ones as well. So thank you for that very insightful interview. Our next session here will take place after the lunch break at around 2 p.m. With my colleague Mark Scott, who will discuss the DMA and its ramifications for the digital industry with a panel of high-level speakers. In the meantime, use this 55-minute break to network with your fellow attendees, discover the many features on our app, and you can send connection requests to other participants, chat with them, set up calls, and create discussions and relationships with potential future collaborators. Thank you very much. My name is Bjarke Smith-Meyer. We'll see you soon.